Hello, folks. How are things going? Hopefully, you're having a good day. I have a marginally good piece of news. I have invested in some new production equipment. So next time you see one of these videos, I will have a new setup. You won't have to stare at my fish tank and my bed in the background, but there'll be a whole new set of things to explore. Now, of course, the quality of the videos probably isn't going to change much. The main determiner of the quality is this thing right here, right? And so I'm pretty sure you already know what to expect. But I have some new gadgets to play around with, which gets me kind of excited, right? So anyway, the goal of this video is to talk about the art of technical communication. And by technical communication, I mean basically communicating with multiple different stakeholders, right? So I don't just mean your fellow engineers within a business. I don't mean scientists communicating with other experts in their area. I mean talking to sales managers, marketing professionals, business people, politicians, whoever else might be interested in your product or service that you're selling, right? And so this is a tricky act, right? And I think most technical communication handbooks don't explain it very well, right? They mostly focus on different genres that you might come across, like memos and letters and reports and those sorts of things. And in a lot of ways, I think that's one of the least important things that you're going to learn from this class, right? Those are things you can easily just sort of look up online if you need to, right? The more difficult thing is learning how to communicate this tough technical stuff to a wide array of different people, right? And so that's why I cited the George Johnson piece, even though I know it has to do with scientific writing, because I think he does a really good job of talking about those issues, right? And the key concept you should have got out of that piece is this idea that he describes as a black box, right? And that's a term he's borrowed from somewhere else. It's a technical concept that's used sometimes in scientific and other contexts, right? And basically, the idea of a black box is it's a device that's operation is sort of mysterious, right? We can't look inside, can't really figure out how it works, right? But we know what gets inputted into the device, right? We know what its inputs are, right? And then once we receive those inputs, we can also predict its outputs, right? And for most of us, most of the technology we work with in our everyday life is a black box, right? Most of us don't know in a lot of detail about how monitors or computers or televisions or speakers or any of those sorts of things work in much detail, right? We just assume that they do, right? And so that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about this instance where we deal with a piece of technology and we treat it as kind of mysterious, even though we know if we put something into it, we know what's going to come out of it, right? And at the very beginning, he tells this narrative about how he learned how to construct an amplifier, right? And I thought this was really illustrative, right? And he talks about how he looked at a schematic, right? So he pulled up the schematic, how the amplifier worked, and kind of stared at all the symbols and things like that. And it was mysterious. Like he couldn't make any sense of the real complicated things the schematic was trying to explain, right? So the strategy he used, what he did is instead of trying to deal with the object as a whole, right, he sort of covered up parts of the schematic, right? And so instead of so he put all that, what he did is he took all that stuff and he kind of put it in a black box, right? He just sort of pretended its operation was mysterious and decided not to focus on that thing in the process of learning about the device, right? And instead, he sort of zeroed in a specific part of the diagram. So he looked at some particular thing, like this little part right here, right? And he decided, okay, I'm going to figure out how this works, right? And then once he was finished with that, then he'd move on to a new section of the diagram and he'd say, okay, now I'm going to have to figure out how this works. And then eventually, through isolating those individual, less complicated parts, he could get a better sense of how the amplifier worked as a whole, right? And so this is a good analogy for technical communication, right? When you're explaining to somebody something to someone who might not have a lot of expertise in the area, you got to zoom in on the things that you think are most important, the things that are most crucial to understanding the operation of the object as a whole, right? And remember, you're not going to be able to explain everything, right? You're going to have to assume some things are going to remain in a black box. They're going to remain mysterious, right? And so you're going to make crucial decisions about what you want to explain and what you don't want to explain, right? Another way of understanding this is I like to think of it kind of like giving the reader training wheels, right? And if you think about like how training wheels work, right? Basically, the goal of training wheels is to isolate a difficult task, which is learning how to balance the bike, right? So the person can learn the other parts of learning how to effectively bike well, right? So, learning how to use the pedals, learning how to steer, and that sort of thing. And as someone who is currently teaching his son how to bike, I can tell you those things do not come instinctively, right? They're things that take time to learn how to do, right? And so then once you learn those tasks, once you learn how to pedal and steer and that sort of thing, then you can take the training wheels off and focus on the difficult task of balancing the bike, right? Doing all those things at once would be impossible, right? But if you isolate pieces of it, let people learn how to do that, then you can slowly build towards a better understanding of the whole, right? So that's the basic idea of what's going on here, right? And so when you're explaining things to a general audience, that's the way you got to think of it, right? You can't give them it all at once, right, in one big complicated mess, right? You got to give them some training wheels, some things they can use to figure out the basics first, and then maybe you can take a step backwards and talk about the more complicated picture that they're not fully understanding, right? So to give you an idea how this works, I'm going to show you a video from a Wired television series or YouTube series called 5 Levels. It's a really fabulous series, right? And if you're really interested in the subject of technical communication, I think there's no better place to sort of explore how this works, right? And basically what the series does is it takes an expert in a particular area, and what they do is they explain a concept to 5 different groups of people at 5 differing levels of complexity, right? So they typically start at elementary school students, right? Then they move to high school students. Then they do an undergraduate. Then they do a graduate student. And then they do a fellow expert, right? And it's really fascinating to watch how their explanations sort of vary over time, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on someone who's pretty similar, I think, to the situation you'll find yourself in when you're describing your products for this class, right? I'm going to focus on a high school student, right? So someone who's been through a lot of education but doesn't really have any expertise in the particular area you're talking about, right? And in this particular case, in this clip that I'm going to show you, it's a quantum scientist explaining to a high school student how quantum computers work, right? And so I want you to pay really close attention to this little clip, right? And I want you to focus particularly on what strategies does she use when she's explaining these difficult concepts, right? And then when I'm finished, I'm going to go ahead and expound on it a little bit further.
What's your favorite kind of computer? Smartphone, tablet, regular, laptop, PC?
I've got to go with my iPhone.
So what do you do with your iPhone?
Social media, use it for studying.
Have you ever run out of space on your iPhone?
All the time.
Me too.
Yeah, always when I'm trying to take a photo.
So did you know that there are certain kinds of problems that computers sort of run out of space almost? Like you're trying to solve the problem, and just like how you run out of space on your iPhone when you're trying to take a picture, if you're trying to solve the problem, you just run out of space. Huh. And even if you have the world's biggest supercomputer, did you know that can still happen?
Wow.
So my team is working on building new kinds of computers altogether, ones that operate by a totally different set of rules. So do you know what that is?
I have no clue.
It's a quantum computer.
A what?
Have you ever heard of a quantum computer?
I haven't.
Have you ever heard of the word quantum?
No.
Okay, so quantum mechanics is a branch of science, just like any other branch of science. It's a branch of physics. It's the study of things that are either really, really small, really, really well isolated, or really, really cold. And this particular branch of science is something we're using to totally reimagine how computing works. So we're building totally new kinds of computers based on the laws of quantum mechanics. That's what a quantum computer is.
Huh.
I'm going to start by telling you about something called superposition. So I'm going to explain it using this giant penny.
Wow. Is that like worth 100 pennies?
I don't know what it's worth, but I can put it face up, right? And that's heads. I can put it face down, right? So at any given time, point in time, if I ask you, is my penny heads or tails, probably you could answer it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But what if I spin the penny? So let's do it. Okay, so while it's spinning, is it heads or tails?
Heads.
While it's spinning?
Oh, I would know.
It's sort of a combination of heads and tails,
yeah.
right? Would you say? So superposition is this idea that my penny is not just either heads or tails. It's in this state, which is a combination of heads and tails. And this quantum property is something that we can have in real physical objects in the world. So that's superposition. And the second thing that we'll talk about is called entanglement. So now I'm going to give you a penny. Wow! When we use the word entangled in everyday language, what do we mean?
That something's intertwined or...
Exactly, that there's two things that are connected in some way, and usually we can separate them again.
Yeah.
If your hair is tangled or whatever, you can unentangle it, right?
Yeah.
But in the quantum world, when we entangle things, they're really now connected. It's much, much harder to separate them again. So using the same analogy, we spin our pennies and eventually they both stop, right? And when they stop, it's either heads or tails, right? So in my case, I got tails and you got heads. You see how they're totally disconnected from each other, right? Our pennies in the real world. Now, if our pennies were entangled and we both spun them together, right? When we stop them, if you measured your penny to be a head, I would measure my penny to be a head. And if you measured your penny to be a tails, I would measure my penny to be a tails. If we measured it at exactly the same time, we would still find that they were both exactly correlated.
That's crazy.
It's so cool, right?
Oh my God.
The way that we are able to actually see these quantum properties is by making our quantum chips really, really cold. So that's what this is all about, actually. This is called a dilution refrigerator, and it's a refrigerator. It doesn't look like a normal refrigerator, right? But it's something that we use. Actually, there's usually a case around it to cool our quantum chips down cold enough that we can create superpositions and we can entangle qubits, and the information isn't lost to the environment.
Like, what could those chips be used to do?
So one of the things that we're trying to use quantum computers to do is simulating chemical bonding. Use a quantum system to model a quantum system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to impress all my friends when I tell them about this. They're going to be like, quantum what?
Anyway, there are a lot of things you should have gotten out of that video, right? One thing hopefully you should have seen is how little they actually accomplished, right? I mean, by the time you were finished, you probably had very little idea of actually what was going on with quantum computing if you didn't know something before, right? But you got some things, right? So you've advanced in your understanding a little bit, right? And if you pay attention, there's 3 tools that she uses in particular to help that high school student understand what's going on, right? And the first tool, and perhaps one of the most important ones, is metaphor, right? So sometimes when she's explaining some concepts, right, she draws metaphors with other situations that are kind of similar, right? So when she's explaining quantum entanglement, for example, she uses the metaphor of a penny, right? And what she does is she spins a penny, which arrives in which rests in 2 different positions, heads and tails, or 1 and 0, if you prefer to view it that way, right? So she spins the penny, right? And she has someone else, and she has the other person spin it too. And then she talks about what would it be like if those 2 pennies were entangled in one way, right? And that's one of the main tools that she uses to get across that key physics concept, right? Another thing she does is she talks about use value, right? So she talks about what quantum computers are good for, right? And very often, I think if you explain the practical value of something, it really helps people understand that thing in more detail, right? So at the very end of the video, she talks about like what quantum computers are good for, and she talks about how it can be used to sort of calculate complex chemical bonds and those sorts of things. And that seemed to really give her some insight into the value of quantum computers and what their uses are, right? And then finally, she also uses a lot of tactile things, so like images that she can use to sort of wrap her mind around the concept, right? And the key image here, other than the pennies, the key image here is of the quantum computer itself, right? And so she shows the refrigeration device that they use in the quantum system, right? And in looking at that, just by looking at that, she immediately gets a better grasp of, oh, this is what a quantum computer is, right? So visuals are extremely important. Diagrams, charts, images are really crucial to quantum communication, or to technical communication, right? Quantum communication. So anyway, let me go ahead and apply this to writing now. So let's see how this works in like a written context, doing something similar to what you guys are doing, right? So I have in my possession, this is one of the few examples of something like this I have, a business plan from a company called Revolution Motors, right? This was a company that was designing new electric vehicles and that sort of thing. And the business plan was designed to get funding for the company, right? The business plan actually ended up failing, right? And I think that it's partially because the device had some practical hurdles. But I think it can teach us a lot about technical communication and how it works and how to explain a complex product to a lot of different audiences, right? And the product they were working on was a 3-wheeled vehicle called Dagny, right? And this is basically an electric car that was extremely narrow, that drove on 3 wheels rather than 2 or 4, like what we're used to, right? And the way they explain this vehicle in their text, this is basically what they said. They said, the dominant source of energy loss for a vehicle at freeway speeds is aerodynamic resistance. So making the vehicle as narrow as possible maximizes how far a given amount of energy will take you. To make such a narrow vehicle stable while cornering, it should lean into turns. Leaning gives the vehicle fantastic cornering capability while providing an amazing driving experience. To minimize the mechanical complexity of a leaning vehicle and improve the aerodynamics, the best arrangement is 2 wheels in front, 1 wheel in the back, so on and so forth, right? Now, the thing I want to point out here is there's a lot of complicated physics stuff going on here, right? There's a lot of research and technical know-how that went into the development of a product this narrow and only works through 3 wheels, right? But what they've done is they've sort of left a lot of those complexities out of this particular document, right? And instead, they're just giving us a flavor. They're just giving us a little bit so we can understand the basic idea behind the product, right? And then if we really need more information, right, we can get it, right? We can, our business can send our engineers over to yours, right? And you can explain the more complicated things over to those people or something along those lines, right? And so that it's really crucial to keep that in mind. You can't explain everything, right? And you got to put some stuff, even if that stuff is really important, in a black box, right? And let your reader inquire about it more if they need to do so, right? A final thing is they use a lot of images throughout the document, and I think product models and images are really important here, right? And so here is an example of an image that they use. This is a prototype of Dagny that they built, right? And I think just reading the document itself, I would have had a lot of trouble like figuring out even what leaning is, right? But looking at this particular image really sort of made that hit home for me, right? And it actually made me realize why this product failed, because this looks terrifying, right? It looks like I'm going to die if I'm driving this particular vehicle, right? But anyways, right, the important thing here, though, is the image helps me understand the product, right? And so when you're working on your product description sections over the next couple of weeks or so, I want you to be doing the same things, right? I want you to be thinking about what kind of metaphors can I use? What images and diagrams do I need to include? How can I talk about the use value of the product to help people understand it, right? And use those tools to help give people insight into the more complex things that are going on beneath the surface.